Between 2015 and 2016, babies at a neonatal unit in northern England began collapsing without warning. Some stopped breathing, some suffered catastrophic medical emergencies, and some died suddenly despite showing signs of improvement only hours earlier. Doctors were confused, nurses were devastated, and grieving parents were left searching for answers. At first, hospital staff believed the deaths were simply tragic coincidences. Premature babies can be incredibly fragile. Not every life can be saved. But as the months passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Whenever a baby unexpectedly collapsed, one member of staff seemed to be there. A nurse named Lucy Letby. Colleagues struggled to believe it. Lucy was trusted. She was experienced. She was well-liked by both parents and co-workers. The idea that she could be harming babies seemed impossible. Yet the number of incidents continued to grow. And eventually, several doctors became convinced that what they were witnessing was not a medical mystery. They believed someone was deliberately hurting children. But when they raised the alarm, they say they were ignored. What followed was one of the most shocking criminal investigations in modern British history. An investigation that would lead to accusations of murder, a years-long trial, and questions that continue to be debated to this day. This is the story of Lucy Letby. Before her name became known around the world, Lucy Letby appeared to be the last person anyone would suspect of harming a child. She was a neonatal nurse working at the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England. Her job was to care for some of the hospital's most vulnerable patients. Premature babies, critically ill newborns, infants who depended on nurses and doctors for every moment of survival. To colleagues, Lucy appeared dedicated to that responsibility. She was described as hardworking, professional, and deeply committed to her patients. She often volunteered for extra shifts. She attended specialized training courses, and she was trusted enough to care for babies requiring the highest levels of medical attention. Outside of work, her life appeared ordinary. She lived alone. She maintained close friendships with colleagues. She regularly shared photos on social media. And there seemed to be little that distinguished her from thousands of other nurses working across the United Kingdom. Parents placed their trust in her. Fellow nurses worked alongside her every day. Doctors relied on her to help care for newborns fighting for their lives. No one imagined that she would eventually become the focus of one of the largest criminal investigations ever conducted within Britain's healthcare system. But behind the reassuring image of a dedicated neonatal nurse, investigators would later identify a disturbing pattern, a pattern that appeared to follow Lucy wherever she worked, and it would begin with a series of medical emergencies that doctors struggled to explain. Babies who were expected to survive suddenly collapsed. Babies who were recovering unexpectedly died. And before long, staff inside the neonatal unit began asking themselves a terrifying question. Were these tragedies really natural? Or was something far more sinister happening inside the hospital? In early 2015, staff at the Countess of Chester Hospital began noticing something unusual. Babies in the neonatal unit were suffering sudden and unexpected collapses. Some stopped breathing without warning. Others experienced dramatic drops in oxygen levels. And in several cases, infants who had appeared stable only hours earlier suddenly died. For doctors and nurses, these incidents were devastating. Neonatal medicine is an inherently difficult field. Premature and critically ill babies can deteriorate quickly. Tragedies do happen, but what troubled staff was not simply that babies were dying, it was how they were dying. Some of the collapses appeared highly unusual. Medical teams found themselves struggling to explain what had happened. In several cases, standard treatments that would normally help had little or no effect. Even experienced doctors found themselves searching for answers. As the months passed, the number of incidents continued to rise. Staff members began comparing notes, looking back through records, discussing cases among themselves, and gradually some started noticing a pattern they could not ignore. Many of the unexpected collapses seemed to occur when the same nurse was on duty. Lucy Letby. At first, few wanted to believe it. Lucy was a respected member of the team. She worked long hours, she cared for extremely vulnerable patients, and she had built strong relationships with both colleagues and parents. The idea that she could somehow be connected to these tragedies felt almost unthinkable. Yet the pattern persisted. Another collapse, another emergency, another death. And once again, Lucy appeared to be present. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Doctors needed evidence. They needed explanations. And most importantly, they needed to know whether they were witnessing a series of terrible coincidences or something far more disturbing. Before long, several consultants became so concerned that they decided they could no longer stay silent. They would raise the alarm. And what happened next would become one of the most controversial chapters in the entire case. As the number of unexplained collapses continued to grow, concern inside the neonatal unit began turning into suspicion. Several senior doctors started noticing something they could no longer ignore. Time and time again, when a baby suffered an unexpected medical emergency, Lucy Letby appeared to be on duty. One incident might have been coincidence. Two incidents might have been bad luck. But as more cases accumulated, some consultants became increasingly uncomfortable with what they were seeing. They began reviewing patient records, comparing dates, comparing shifts, looking for anything that might explain the pattern, and according to those doctors, the same name kept appearing. Lucy Letby. The concerns were serious enough that consultants raised them with hospital management. They did not claim to know exactly what was happening. They did not have definitive proof. But they believed the pattern demanded urgent attention. If there was even a possibility that a member of staff was connected to these incidents, they argued, action needed to be taken immediately. Yet the response they received was not what they expected. Hospital administrators were reluctant to accept the allegations. Lucy had no history of misconduct. She was regarded as a competent and trusted nurse. To some members of management, the idea that she could be intentionally harming babies seemed almost impossible to believe. As a result, tensions inside the hospital began to grow. Doctors continued raising concerns. Management continued asking for stronger evidence. Meanwhile, babies continued to collapse. The disagreement created a deeply uncomfortable situation. Some consultants believed vulnerable patients were at risk. Others feared that an innocent nurse was being unfairly accused. The stakes could not have been higher. Eventually, the concerns became impossible to ignore. Lucy Letby was removed from frontline clinical duties and reassigned to administrative work. But even then, the controversy did not end. In fact, it was only beginning, because the battle over what was happening inside the neonatal unit would soon spread far beyond the hospital walls. And before long, police would be called in to investigate what doctors increasingly believed were not natural deaths at all. By 2016, concerns about Lucy Letby were no longer being raised by just one doctor. Multiple consultants had independently reached the same conclusion. They believed there was a connection between Lucy's presence and the growing number of unexplained collapses on the neonatal unit. The warnings had become impossible to ignore. Yet, according to several doctors, meaningful action still did not come quickly enough. Instead, a bitter disagreement developed between senior clinicians and hospital management. Consultants argued that vulnerable babies could be at risk. They wanted Lucy removed from clinical duties while the incidents were investigated. Hospital administrators, however, remained cautious. Accusing a nurse of deliberately harming patients was an extraordinary allegation. Without definitive proof, management was reluctant to take drastic action. As tensions escalated, relationships inside the hospital began to fracture. Doctors felt their concerns were not being taken seriously. Management worried that serious accusations were being made without sufficient evidence. Meanwhile, the unexplained incidents continued. Eventually, Lucy Letby was removed from frontline nursing duties and assigned to an administrative role. For many of the consultants who had raised concerns, the decision came far too late. They believed the warning signs had been visible for months. But even after Lucy was moved away from patients, the controversy did not end. In fact, it grew even larger. Some doctors later claimed they were pressured to apologize to Lucy for the suspicions that had been raised against her. The situation had evolved far beyond a disagreement about medical outcomes. It had become a battle over accountability. Who was responsible for the rising number of deaths? And why had it taken so long for concerns to be acted upon? As those questions intensified, hospital leaders eventually accepted that the matter could no longer be handled internally. The pattern of deaths and collapses required an independent investigation. What began as a hospital dispute was about to become a major criminal inquiry, and once detectives started reviewing the evidence, the case would grow far larger than anyone had imagined. By 2017, concerns about the deaths and collapses at the Countess of Chester Hospital had moved beyond internal hospital discussions. What had once been treated as a medical mystery was now the focus of a major police investigation. The operation was given a name: Operation Hummingbird. Detectives from Cheshire Police were tasked with reviewing every suspicious death and unexplained collapse that had occurred within the neonatal unit. It was an enormous undertaking. Investigators examined years of medical records. Thousands of documents were collected. Doctors, nurses, parents, and hospital staff were interviewed. Specialists were brought in to review cases independently. The goal was simple: determine whether these tragedies had natural explanations, or whether criminal acts had taken place inside the hospital. As investigators worked through the evidence, they focused on a series of cases that doctors had found particularly unusual. In several incidents, babies had suffered sudden collapses that experts struggled to explain through normal medical causes alone. Detectives began building timelines, comparing patient records, examining staffing schedules, looking for patterns. Once again, one name repeatedly appeared: Lucy Letby. The findings were significant enough that, in July 2018, police arrested Lucy for the first time. She was questioned on a suspicion of murdering several babies and attempting to murder others. The arrest shocked the public. For years, Lucy had been viewed as a caring neonatal nurse. Now she was at the center of one of the most serious criminal investigations in modern British healthcare. Yet after questioning, she was released while the investigation continued. Detectives were still gathering evidence, and Operation Hummingbird was far from over. Over the following years, investigators continued reviewing cases and consulting medical experts. The scope of the inquiry grew larger and larger. More records were analyzed. More witnesses came forward, and prosecutors began assembling what they believed was a compelling case. Eventually, police concluded that the evidence pointed towards something unthinkable. They alleged that the deaths and collapses were not accidents. They were deliberate acts. The next challenge would be proving that claim in court, and the evidence prosecutors planned to present would become the subject of intense scrutiny during one of the longest and most closely watched criminal trials in recent British history. When Lucy Letby's trial finally began in October 2022, prosecutors faced a difficult challenge. There was no confession, no eyewitness, and no piece of evidence that could, by itself, explain every incident. Instead, the prosecution built its case by examining what they argued was a clear and disturbing pattern. Over months of testimony, jurors heard evidence relating to multiple babies who had either died or suffered unexpected collapses while under Lucy's care. Prosecutors alleged that these incidents were not natural medical events. They argued that several babies had been deliberately harmed using different methods, including the injection of air into the bloodstream and the administration of excessive amounts of insulin. Medical experts were called to explain why they believed some of the collapses could not be adequately explained by natural causes alone. The defense strongly disagreed. Lucy's lawyers argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on the circumstantial evidence. They suggested that the neonatal unit was dealing with serious staffing shortages and operational problems. According to the defense, the babies involved were already extremely vulnerable patients. Tragic outcomes, they argued, did not necessarily mean criminal acts had occurred, but prosecutors pointed to additional evidence recovered during the investigation. When police searched Lucy Letby's home, they discovered documents and handwritten notes that would later receive significant attention during the trial. Among those notes were emotional writings in which Lucy expressed feelings of guilt, self-doubt, and despair. One note included phrases that prosecutors argued were highly incriminating. The defense, however, maintained that the writings reflected the emotional strain of being accused, not an admission of murder. Jurors also heard evidence that Lucy had searched for the parents of some babies on social media after the incidents occurred. Prosecutors argued that these searches were unusual and concerning. The defense responded that curiosity alone was not evidence of guilt. As the trial continued, The jury was presented with thousands of pages of medical records, expert testimony, staffing schedules, and investigative findings. It became one of the longest criminal trials in modern British history, and after months of hearing evidence from both sides, the case would ultimately come down to a single question. Had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Lucy Letby was responsible? The answer would be determined by the jury, and their verdict would make headlines around the world. In October 2022, after years of investigation, Lucy Letby went on trial at Manchester Crown Court. The proceedings would last for months. It became one of the longest and most closely watched criminal trials in modern British history. Prosecutors alleged that Lucy had murdered 7 babies and attempted to murder several others while working at the Countess of Chester Hospital between 2015 and 2016. Throughout the trial, jurors heard extensive medical evidence, expert testimony, hospital records, and accounts from doctors, nurses, and parents. Prosecutors argued that the collapses and deaths were not random tragedies. They claimed the evidence showed a deliberate pattern of harm. Lucy Letby denied every allegation. Her defense team maintained that she was innocent. They argued that the prosecution had built its case on circumstantial evidence and disputed many of the conclusions presented by medical experts. The trial continued for nearly a year. As testimony unfolded, families were forced to relive some of the most painful moments of their lives. Parents who had trusted the neonatal unit with their newborn children sat through weeks of evidence describing what prosecutors believed had happened. Then, in August 2023, the jury reached its verdict. Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. She was acquitted on some charges, while the jury was unable to reach verdicts on several others. The verdict sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom. A nurse once trusted to care for society's most vulnerable patients had become one of Britain's most notorious convicted child killers. During sentencing, the judge described the crimes as a cruel and calculated betrayal of trust. Lucy Letby was given multiple whole-life orders, meaning she would spend the rest of her life in prison without the possibility of release. For many families, the verdict represented justice, but it did not answer every question. Because even after the trial ended, attention began shifting towards something else. How had the warning signs gone unnoticed for so long? Why were doctors' concerns not acted upon sooner? And could some of the deaths have been prevented if intervention had come earlier? Those questions would soon become the focus of a major public inquiry and a debate that continues to this day. For many people, the guilty verdict marked the end of the case. But for others, it was only the beginning of a new set of questions. Attention soon shifted away from Lucy Letby herself and toward the hospital where the crimes had taken place. Families wanted to know how so many incidents could occur before decisive action was taken. Doctors had repeatedly raised concerns, yet months passed before police became involved. Why? Could some of the babies have been saved if those warnings had been acted upon sooner? Those questions became the focus of a major public inquiry. Investigators examined the actions of hospital management, the response to concerns raised by consultants, and whether opportunities to intervene had been missed. For many families, accountability extended beyond a single person. They wanted to understand how a trusted healthcare professional was able to remain in a position of responsibility while suspicions continued to grow. At the same time, the case continued to generate debate and discussion long after the trial ended. Medical experts, journalists, and legal commentators continued examining the evidence, the investigation, and the decisions made throughout the case. But regardless of those debates, one fact remained unchanged. The deaths of multiple babies devastated families whose lives would never be the same. And for those families, the impact of the case did not end when the verdict was delivered. It is a tragedy that continues to be felt years later, and one that has left lasting questions about trust, accountability, and patient safety within the healthcare system. Lucy Letby was convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder several others. But years later, questions still remain about how the warning signs were missed for so long. For many families, the search for accountability did not end with the verdict. Thank you for watching.